And now for tonight's feature presentation. Okay, here we go. So, the truth of the matter is, tonight's lecture belongs really neither here nor there nor anywhere. It is still part of the history of Jerusalem. And our
Rabbi,
last
you're not in Sicha, you're not in projection mode. You're in. You've got the two sides side by each.
Oh, and I thought we tested this. Okay, let's try again. Okay. Share screen. Is it good now?
Metzion.
Okay. So once again, this is what happened in our last lecture. I tried to describe this. There's a somewhat dark period in between the takeover of Islam and the Crusades. There's just very little documentation that is written, and most of our information comes from this repository called the Cairo Geniza. And so we tried to describe that period of time. This is a little bit of odds and ends that I just could not let go from that time period. It does not relate to Jerusalem in a super exact sense, like next week's lecture, or the next installment, which is going to be about, in fact, the Crusades, which will ultimately be an attempt for the Christians to take Jerusalem from the infidels, from the Muslims. There's not a lot of things that happen here geographically proximate to Jerusalem, although there are a few. But these things are happening in the Jewish community, and I think it's very important. It also has a lot of relevancy, as I'll point out along the way, to things that are happening in Israel right now. So the title is Splits and Grafts, Karaites and Khazars. So let's first start by talking about splits in Judaism. Now, there's a great professor of Jewish history named Jacob Katz. And when I say great professor, he really may be the greatest professor of Jewish history that I've ever studied. I absolutely love Jacob Katz. He does fascinating things on the history of halacha. He does fascinating work on the emergence of modernity and rabbinic responses to modernity. He's brilliant, he's insightful, he's a sociologist, he's a scholar of first rate. And Jacob Katz has a theory about fatal schisms in Judaism. Now, as bad as the fights over kashrut are, and what you're allowed to do on Shabbat, and can you use the Shabbat switch, can you not use the Shabbat switch, is triangle K kosher, is triangle K not kosher, Judaism doesn't split over those things. It also doesn't split over, what kind of tefillin you have. Those are not what causes the splits in Judaism. The things that cause splits in Judaism are the questions of who is a Jew. And a fascinating case of that, I think, is the case of how many wives are you allowed to have. Now, you might think that the case of how many wives you're going to have would split the Jewish people because, this is sort of a strange thing. This is almost adultery. It's not quite adultery, but it gets close to adultery. You might think that might, in fact, split the Jewish community. And so what we're going to look at here is the question of polygamy during the times of the Muslim conquest. Now, somebody tell me why, before I go to the next slide, somebody tell me why this is interesting. Polygamy and the Muslim conquest.
I'll take it.
Go for it. Go for it, Des.
The Muslims allowed polygamy, and once it was allowed in the lands that they conquered, the Jews probably decided that they could also take advantage of that opportunity.
Okay, so you use allowed in the past tense.
No, but sorry, but before that, there's nothing in Torah that says that a man cannot have more than one wife. This is a later edict that came through from rabbinic law to basically emulate or copy the Christian realm, which had single wives.
Okay.
So we just basically started it.
So I see. It's Muslims versus Christians. It's nothing organically Jewish here, right? So
Yep.
David had many wives, Solomon had many wives, right? The idea of multiple wives is not necessarily foreign to Judaism. I will just tell you a personal story that I was once on a plane traveling back. I was actually going to Howard Kolner's. I was coming back on my way to, I think it was maybe can't remember if it was Esti Kolner or Leo Kolner's bar bat mitzvah, and the gentleman sitting next to me was telling me that he's got this new wife in Ohio, but his wife in Jerusalem is very upset, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. I can't figure out what his wife's upset about. His wife, did you divorce the first one? But he was a Jerusalem Arab, who Jerusalem Muslim, who apparently had two wives, and they lived in two different countries. So it was just a bit of a revelation. I had never encountered that before. Now, here's the thing. As both Dan and Des pointed out, that this is true. That generally speaking, that you could have in places in the Muslim Caliphate, Jews did allow multiple wives. But what's interesting is in Jerusalem, it seems that the custom and the tradition was that there was only one wife, and this may have been a holdover from the fact that before the Christians had a restriction for one wife, the Roman Empire did, and Israel was controlled by the Roman Empire for a long period of time before the Muslims ever showed up. And so it's very possible that that's related. And Muslim law, as we've said, allows you to have 4 wives. Now, what's even more interesting is this is not just the musing of some rabbi with an interest in history. We have a tshuva of the Rashba. The Rashba is Rabbi Shimon ben Aderet, who lives in essentially the 13th century. Sorry, the 14th century. He's a contemporary of Nachmanides, and he writes many, many tshuvot, which are very authoritative, and he literally writes, "Harambam mare panim lahater sheyisa nashim rabot keminhag Yishmaelim," that the Rambam allows for this, and he connects it directly to the custom of the Yishmaelim, of the Muslims. Now, the Israeli Geonim, right? If you remember, there were 2 schools of Gaonic wisdom. There were 3 schools, but 2 of them were in Babylon. Sura and Pumbedita were the Gaonic academies in Babylon. And the Gaonic academies in Babylon allowed for more than one wife. And the Israeli Geonim, it's not that they didn't allow more than one wife. They just made it very difficult. Because if a man were to take a second wife, his current wife could require him to do 2 things. Number 1, pay out her ketubah, and number 2, he would have to divorce his wife if he took a second. So she could sue for divorce, and presumably the court would back her. So she had a very strong legal position for remedy, and presumably the ketubah is set up to make her financially independent. And so she could, if you want a second wife, abi gesund, I will take the fortune and go get my own apartment, and then I don't have to deal with your snoring. That kind of a scenario. So in Jerusalem, this was a bit of a remedy. There are some scholars who believe that the position of Rabbeinu Gershon is the Ashkenazic rabbi who is known for the edict, which actually has elapsed, but we still preserve it today, that forbid Ashkenazic Jews from taking a second wife. Many of the customs of the Jews of Ashkenaz were taken from the customs of the land of Israel as opposed to the customs of Babylon. I could go down that rabbit hole a little bit, but that would take us far afield. But it's sort of interesting to see that the precursor for real Jewish monogamy comes from the position of the Geonim of Eretz Yisrael, of Jerusalem. But what's fascinating, as we pointed out in our last episode, is that a lot of our information comes from a very unique source. And this unique source is the Cairo Geniza. So there are scholars who read, the Arabic, the Aramaic, the Hebrew. They put together the fragments of these documents, of which there were many. The Geniza is not really in Cairo. It's in Fustat, which is where the poorer Jews tended to live. But they've gone through these documents over and over again, and I got my information from an article by a researcher named Mordechai Friedman, who wrote an article called Polygamy in Jewish Tradition and Practice, Sources from the Cairo Geniza. This is published in 1982, and it has some fascinating little gems of thought. Now, these are just, in a way, a bit more of passing interest, perhaps a little bit of lurid voyeurism, if you will, but I think it sheds some interesting light to things, and maybe we can get some special points of information here. First of all, bigamy was the privilege of the wealthy. That if you wanted to have a second wife, she was entitled to a second home, which means that if you were a noch-schlepper, if you were poor, or even middle class, this wasn't something that was available to you. It was generally something that belonged to the wealthy, but in a very unique position, because the truth of the matter is, wealthy fathers would give large dowries, and they negotiated terms with that dowry that forbade a second wife. And here you could put a stipulation in the ketubah that there was a massive penalty, or he's not allowed to take a second wife without her permission, and that was considered binding. And to this day, if I'm not mistaken, if you read an Ashkenazi ketubah, there's nothing about a second wife. You don't need it, because Ashkenazim have to conform to the edict of Rabbi Gershon, the Takana of Rabbi Gershon, which says you can't take a second wife. Sephardim don't have that provision, and you write into the ketubah, Shelo yisa isha acheret aleha, you can't take a second wife on top of her, which precedent might come from the way in which they manage things, or wealthy families manage things, is that they put enough money into the dowry to say, look, she is your wife. If you want to take another, then there'll be a financial penalty, or you can't do so without her, and those seem to stand the test of time. There are also evidence of some other interesting things that took place. So, first of all, we saw that wealthy men who wanted a second wife would probably have to seek brides from the lower or middle classes. And there's one example of that was there's a well-to-do courtier who had a wife and was intent on marrying 3 more. And so we know that the first wife that he took was a woman that he ransomed from slavery and who was raped in that context. And this is something we learned directly from the Cairo Geniza documents. What I think is interesting about this is that we tend to think of bigamy as a really cruel practice, and I'm not here to advocate for bigamy in any sense. But one of the things that you might see in this is that you have a woman who is the victim of sexual abuse, who herself was a slave, and is essentially redeemed from slavery, and I would hope she had a happy marriage after that. I can't say for sure, but it was at least a vehicle of some kind of social mobility and some kind of safety net in certain cases. That's not to say that it belongs in our society, just sort of rather to be able to give it a bit of the color of right in certain circumstances in the medieval context. Just one other thing to note about that is Shlomo Dov Gotthein, who is really maybe the great scholar of the Cairo Geniza, he writes, our marital life in light of the Geniza documents show it was a minor social evil. In other words, it was sort of tolerated on the outskirts in limited situations, but it was not something which was prevalent. It was perhaps more allowed because it was happening in Muslim society, but really it's not something that the Jewish community really wanted to adopt in a full-throated manner. But what is most important for us in our discussion is that it is not one of those things that split the Jewish community, right? It is not, it's not one of the, it's like, Shabbat, Tefillin, etc., that does not split the Jewish community. It's not like who is a Jew. If you took 2 wives and you had children, children of the second wife were considered fully Jewish. You could get shidduchim. You could marry a Jew from Jerusalem. We don't have any evidence that people stopped marrying people who were the product of homes that had a second marriage. And you could say that that's the kind of difference, that's kind of a social fabric difference, which might split Judaism, but it did not. And so maybe that's our first rule, is Katz's theory about fatal schisms in Judaism. We don't have fatal schisms over Shabbat or simple matters of halacha. And by fatal schism, it means a group that just ups and leaves the Jewish community. We're going to see that there's another version of that very soon. And maybe, depending on how far we get in Jewish history, we're going to see that there are several groups that took this wrong left turn. Mordechai, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Rabbi. Historically, going all the way back, Avram Avinu, Noach, when was the first recognized or official marriage? Did it just sort of grow onto people, and also, if we go back to the beginning, to subdue or
Okay, so I'm gonna just attack your question from a pure halachic standpoint. There are the marriages of the Bnei Noach, which include everybody from Adam all the way to Amram and Yocheved, right? The generation before Moshe. Generation of Moshe, they convert at Sinai, and then they have a whole set of laws that are our 613 commandments, which replace the 7 Noachide commandments. And in those set of laws, marriage is listed. I don't think the Torah tells us who got the first Mazel Tov in the desert.
No.
So I'm not sure I can tell you who got the first Mazel Tov, but that's presumably where it started. If you're asking me who's the first person who has 2 wives, I'm just pushing my imagination, and it's very possible that I'm missing. Lemech has 2 wives. He's the first person that I can think of who has 2 wives in the Noachide code, and in the Sinai code, perhaps it is David HaMelech who's the one who has the. But I never really kept score, so I could be missing someone. So anyway, okay.
But doesn't Abraham have 2 wives? He married Sarah and.
He has Hagar. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Lemech for sure has 2 wives. Avram's situation is a little bit more nuanced because Hagar might be a Pilegesh. It's a bit of a different marriage contract. So, that's I guess a bit of a nuanced story. Yeah, Dan.
But Yaakov Avinu had 4
Yaakov's
wives.
is problematic because.
Oh.
Yeah, Yaakov's is problematic because Yaakov has 2 sisters.
No, but beyond that, he had the 2 others with him.
Yes. Okay, I'm not disagreeing, but before he had the 2 others, he had 2 sisters.
Okay.
2 sisters is itself problematic because the Torah tells us you're not allowed to have 2 sisters.
Yeah,
Some of the commentators say that when we're a little off the subject, but when he comes into the land of Israel, that's why Rachel dies, because you can't live in the land of Israel and be in violation of Jewish law. So
quite
a bit of
okay.
yeah. This is a bit of a off our topic. I mean, it's a very important topic, but again, I want to just come back to the fact that there may have been a reason in the ancient world for bigamy in terms of supporting people as a welfare mechanism, but as human society became more prosperous and women became more educated and we moved away from the farm and all sorts of things like that, then the bigamy became something that we tolerated less, and I think it's not a bad thing that we left that particular aspect. I think monogamy suits us. Okay, now let's get to schisms. Here we talk about the Karaite schism, and this is the schism that starts with Anan ben David. Now, Anan ben David is someone who is known to us because he had real claims of succession to this position that the Jewish community had called the Exilarch, the Reish Giluta. The Reish Giluta was the like the fourth in line to the crown or something like that. And he was the head of the Jewish community. It was a very significant position, had real political power. They were all descended from the house of David. And Anan ben David essentially lost that claim, and he was probably rejected because he was known to be profligate in behavior and impious in disposition. And so the Arabs put him in jail because the Arabs felt that if he was opposing the leader of the Jewish community, who is the scion of David HaMelech, and they had great veneration for David HaMelech, so they threw him in jail. Now, in jail, he realizes that he can. They say that he was in jail with a rationalist Muslim scholar, philosopher, who told him how to get out of jail. And the way that he was instructed to do so was say, "Oh no, I'm not against Judaism. I'm a completely different religion. They are Rabbinites. They follow the words of the rabbis. I'm something totally different. I am someone who follows the text of the scripture purely without any involvement of the rabbis." And we have fragments of the story, but it's not ever fully told out in any of the sources, and there are some, I would say that we have scant support and evidence to fully fill out this story. But Anan ben David writes a book called the Sefer HaMitzvot, and it is in around the year 770, no relationship to the address on Ocean Parkway. Around the year 770, he splits off. He's not a terribly charismatic figure, so the Karaite movement doesn't really take off so much for him. But one of the things that he says, and this sort of defines the Karaite movement, he says, "Forsake the words of the Mishnah and the Talmud, and I will compose you a Talmud of my own." And the writings of Anan ben David, if you read them, they are very, very close to Talmudic reasonings, even though he says, "I'm reading the scripture exactly as it is." And there are real problems with trying to interpret the Torah without an oral tradition. Simple things like, what is a totafot that you're supposed to put between your eyes? Another example is, in this week's parsha, we're told about ayin tachat ayin, shein tachat shein. Right? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Are you really supposed to do that? How are you supposed to do that? That is really quite a difficult problem to answer. And really, you need an interpretive tradition to understand the Bible itself. It is really, as Anan learned himself, it is not super simple to try and just read the words of the Chumash and live a Torah life, or even to interpret this text. There's some there's some journalist who has this funny book called A Year of Living Biblically, and he sort of does the same thing. He sort of tries to make a mockery of the Torah by reading it without its interpretive tradition. And so the interpretive tradition is exceedingly important, and what Anan ben David tries to do is he tries to excise that. And when the Karaite religion comes to Jerusalem, it is brought there in the 10th century, and the critical element was the denial of rabbinic tradition and the stewards of that tradition, the Geonim. And why are they called Karaites? So they call themselves Karaim. So if you see this word, Karaim means the readers, right? Kra is scripture. So you could call it scripturism, or they call themselves biblicists. And this term is first used in the 9th century. So it wasn't used by Anan ben David, but it starts to be used by this group. And this group says, well, we don't accept any parts of the Talmud. We don't accept any parts of oral law. You guys have taken us astray. So many of the critical pieces of the way Judaism is practiced, how you understand what Shabbat looks like, how you divorce a woman, how you marry a woman and a man together, how you put on tefillin, how you write a Torah. All of these things are things that are going to be very, very different for the Karaites. And there is a Jew named Daniel Al-Kusmi who founds the Karaite Center in Jerusalem. I told you there were going to be a couple references to Jerusalem. This is one of them. He founds the Karaite Center in Jerusalem, and he says, okay, we're going to have a Rosh Yeshiva, we're going to have an academy, we're going to have Nisi'im, sort of like an Exilarch, we're going to pattern ourselves on the Jews, we're going to be totally different. And what is interesting is the former president of Yeshiva University, Dr. Bernard Revel, he did documentation on the Karaites, and he found that they integrated influence from sects like the Qumran sect. Maybe they found texts of the Qumran that were lying around, that were being passed around Jerusalem, or maybe there were remnants of the sect itself. But they sort of gravitated to the, I hate to use the term, but the sort of weird, offbeat, other than mainstream rabbinic Judaism. And so now we have something which is going to be entirely schismatic. It's going to create a rift in Judaism between people who are going to adhere to the Talmud and rabbinic law, and people who are going to say, you know what, we're tossing the Talmud out. This is a very big deal. I don't usually get to do this, but I can pull off my shelf a book here, which is called the Sefer HaKabbalah of Ibn Daud. And the Sefer HaKabbalah is a sort of contemporary of Maimonides. And one of the things he tries to deal with is arguments in the Talmud. And he tries to deal with why there's some arguments in the Talmud. And his fundamental argument is that, there were some people who just didn't take super excellent notes. And so they had some disagreements. But all the disagreements are about really minor details. But the central things are all agreed upon. Everybody agrees what Shema should be said on. Everyone agrees on how the calendar comes together. Everybody agrees on what chametz is on Pesach, right? There's just little minor disagreements. Is it 18 minutes or 22 minutes for matzah? All those kinds of things. What is also interesting is that he writes this book, and he writes a catalog of the lineage of Torah Shebaal Peh, of the beginning from Moses to his day. He catalogs every scholar that he can to show the immaculate transmission of the rabbis. And this book is written as a polemic against this schism of the Karaites. There is still, I believe, a Karaite center in Jerusalem today. They're a very minor sect, but probably in the days of Maimonides, that's when they had their full bloom. So it took them 3 or 4 centuries to really gain strength. But one of the things that turns out it's really hard to do in when you're a Karaite and you say, look, all we're going to do is read this book, and we're going to get all the right answers just by reading the Torah itself without any consensus or rabbinic interpretation. So this is what a Yaakov al-Kirkisani, right, in the first half of the 10th century, in a Karaite book called Kitab al-Anwar. He says, this is what I'm inclined to mention. From what I can remember of the difference, the matter daily growing worse. Meaning, every day it gets worse how much difference there is between all these Karaite rabbis. Or all these, they're not rabbis, all these Karaite interpreters. We arrive at knowledge by means of our intellects, and where this is the case, it is undeniable that disagreement will arise. So this is the first deconstructionism, if you will, that they run into this scenario where they can't agree on how to even read the Chumash. And so we have this major schism, and the major schism is based on the fact that they just want to throw out the entire Mishnah and Talmud. And the Mishnah and Talmud are central to the way in which we understand and live Judaism. This is something that fundamentally deals with who is a Jew, because in order to be a Jew, you have to be willing to accept the interpreted tradition that goes along with the Chumash. It's not enough to just accept the Chumash. You have to accept its interpretation as well. Was there a question there? No? Okay. All right. So much on, we did the schisms part. What about the grafts? So there is a fascinating story which is the story of the Kuzari. The Kuzari was a book that was written by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the year 1140. And in 1140, the story comes about the conversion of the king of the Khazars and his entire nation to Judaism. The way Halevi presents it is that he has a dream. And the dream is that he's got good philosophy, but he hasn't perfected his works. And so he goes in search of all the wisdom he can find, a philosopher, a Christian, a Muslim, and a rabbi. And he sets them up in this debate. And the debate is conducted, and the rabbi is clearly the wisest. And so the king of the Khazars converts to Judaism and his entire kingdom with him. Now, Micha Goodman, who is a contemporary Israeli author, he has one of his first books is called Cholamo Shel HaKuzari, the dream of the king of Khazar, and he writes something I think is very interesting. He says the Kuzari is an important story because it's a proto-Zionist story. Because if the story of modern Israel is that the nation of Jews becomes a state, the story of the Khazars is that there is a state that becomes Jewish, right? It's the opposite of, we're a people who wandered around the world needing a state. We were a nation, we were a religion, and then we got a state. The Khazars were a state in search of a philosophy, and they find Judaism and become a Jewish state. So it's sort of the only other example of a Jewish state besides the state of Israel. Now, the question is, did this really take place? So first of all, just to give you a little color here, this is a picture of Caucasus Jews, circa 1876. Maybe this is what the Khazars looked like after conversion, I'm assuming. Now, where is Khazarstan? So Khazarstan is somewhere between the Volga River, the Sea of Azov, and the Caucasus Mountains, is where they would have lived. The evidence for them is that they're mostly a nomadic tribe. They were nomadic tribes that lived in that area. There was a king, but it wasn't a place which was a highly developed civilization. There was still a lot of hunter-gatherer sort of organization in that group. Yehuda Halevi's sources came to a large extent from letters that were probably written or that were received by Ibn Shaprut. Ibn Shaprut lives circa 915, or he dies around 915. 915 to 975 is Ibn Shaprut. And Ibn Shaprut receives these letters. They're written actually in very beautiful Hebrew with a little bit of Arabic influence that tells about the conversion of the king of the Khazars that more or less conforms to Yehuda Halevi's book, the Kuzari, and its frame story about this conversion of this king. There are other pieces of evidence as well. There are Arab pieces of evidence. The Muruj al-Dahab, right? The Meadows of Gold. I'm sure it's on everybody's nightstand. This is, one of those books that we've all heard about. No, I say in jest, he is, if you will, he's a bit of a Marco Polo of the Arab world, and he writes that the king of the Khazars had already become a Jew in the caliphate of Harun al-Rashid. So Harun al-Rashid lives around the year 800. Yehuda Halevi's dating of this conversion was 740. Muruj al-Dahab puts it at around the year 800. So maybe that's a tolerable mistake. And it says there joined him Jews from all the lands of Islam and from all the country of the Greeks. So his report is they converted, and then the Jews were like, oh, awesome, we have a state too. So they went and joined the Khazars in their state, according to the Meadows of Gold by Muruj al-Dahab. There's another Arab historian who is Al-Masudi, who is called the Heroditus of the Arabs. And he writes as follows: the reason for the conversion of the king of the Khazars, who had previously been a heathen, to Judaism was as follows. He had adopted Christianity, and then he recognized the wrongness of his belief and began to speak with one of his governors about the concern with which he was filled. The other said to him, "O king, the people of the book form three classes. Invite them and inquire of them, then follow whichever is in possession of the truth." So he sent to the Christians for a bishop, and now there was with him a Jew skilled in debate who disputed with the bishop, asking, etc., etc. And, one thing after another, and what do you know? The rabbi won the debate. Now this story is very rich for the Jews. Why is it rich for the Jews? Because in the middle of this war between these great powers of Christianity and Islam, here you have an objective heathen who says, okay, tell me which one's right. And what does he choose? He chooses door number 3. He chooses the less beautiful bride, so to speak, that had neither the power of the Christians nor that of the Muslims, and he chooses Judaism. So this is a great story for us. We always knew we were the best. Now we have some objective evidence. So we love this story, and as I said, there's some Arab sources that substantiate it as well. Here's a third Arab source. Al-Istakri is the Muslim traveler of the late 10th century. Here's a little drawing of his. It's actually a map of the world. Those red circles are islands. Fascinating how he drew his maps. That's the Mediterranean up there. Anyway, leaving that aside, he says many Khazars converted, but the Jews are the smallest of religions amongst the Khazars, even though the king converted. So he gives a very different perspective on the whole thing. And he says, yes, there was a conversion, but it wasn't the entire population. The whole place did not become Jewish. This is actually a fairly important question, because there's a school of anti-Semitism that's out there that says there are no Jews really. And the Khazars didn't really convert. It's just this nation of weird Khazars really are the Jews of today. Their claim is that you and I are all a bunch of Khazar descendants who aren't really Jewish, but we thought Judaism was cool, so we sort of leached onto this. But the Jews really died out. And there were a couple of geneticists who took Turkish DNA as a surrogate for the Khazar DNA and tried to prove who we were based on this. That has been, I think, largely discredited. But if we want to come to a real final understanding of this whole picture, so perhaps, looking at all of the evidence, and I can't say that I've read through all the evidence and I understand all of the different pieces and all of the things that are missing, but I will say that there is someone who did. Shaul Stampfer, a professor of Eastern European Jewish history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who I assume is an observant Jew. So he writes an article about all of the evidence about the Khazars. And he says, did the Khazars or a significant group of Khazars headed by their king convert to Judaism or not? The simplest and most convincing answer is that the story of the Khazar Jewishness is a legend with no factual basis. The Hebrew sources are pseudepigraphic. What does that mean? Pseudepigrapha means they're historical inventions. Throughout the Middle Ages, it was very typical, to many examples of people who sort of invent history and they create letters, and it's sort of all, very interesting narrative, but it's not true. And part of the example is you have this sort of medieval nomadic, very primitive group of people called the Khazars. And there's a letter between the king of Khazars and Ibn Shaprut, or a descendant of the king of Khazars and Ibn Shaprut, which is written in a flowering, beautiful Hebrew that probably 100 people in the world could write on that level, with the influence of Arabic. It would be the equivalent of hearing that there was a tribe of Inuit who converted to Judaism, and they wrote with the exquisiteness of Chaim Nachman Bialik, with an influence from Edward Said of the Palestinian National Committee, and it was a letter between Rabbi Rosenblatt and this Inuit chief who had maybe a translator who could write in that level of Hebrew. That's before Google Translate. So that's why he says it doesn't, the Jewish sources are not ringing true. And then he says, the Arabic sources are best understood as rumors, and the other sources are not convincing. So his answer is, maybe there wasn't. Now, before we take away my smicha for saying that the story upon which the Kuzari is based may not be true, let's just say the following. Number one is Yehuda Levi is the great truth of the Kuzari is remains because everybody agrees that Yehuda Levi is putting his own words into the various scholars, the philosopher, the Christian, the Muslim, and the rabbi. And the great contribution of Yehuda Levi, if you read Goodman's book is that Yehuda Levi has something above Rambam, because Rambam's a great rationalist, but Yehuda Levi says, there's something else. There's a Yiddish sense. There's a sixth sense that you get that in terms of the veracity of Judaism. There is a sense of spirituality that you cannot put your finger upon, which is a very important thing to key into, and that's something that really transcends Rambam, who is hyper rational. It's all about a logical understanding. So Kuzari, in certain ways, is very ahead of his time in terms of that religious philosophy of inner feeling, and that's the value of Yehuda Levi's book, is in the philosophy, not the historical frame story. So we have to not take away my smicha, because I think that Kuzari is a valuable book on those terms. The second thing is, if I told you that there wasn't a group of nomadic Turkish Caucasian shepherds who converted to Judaism, does it shake your faith? Does it surprise you that after thinking that we did have a state that adopted Judaism, that in the end we never got a state that way, that there was no one we could rely on, that the only thing we have was the 4 cubits of halacha, Hashem, and the dream of returning to Zion? I would say that's probably the case. We all have felt that way. I don't think there was a time in Jewish history where we said, what? Let's send a message to the king of the Khazars. He'll save us from Khmelnytsky. Let's send a message to the king of the Khazars. He's going to save us from the Crusades. Let's send a message to the king of the Khazars. He's going to save us from the, whoever. I think in the backs of our minds, we knew there wasn't some distant cousin, some group of people who had adopted Judaism who are going to come and save us. So, schisms and grafts. There were schisms. I don't think there were grafts. When we meet next, though, we're going to meet what may be the greatest Jewish challenge to Jerusalem, to Judaism, from between the destruction of the temple and the Nazis, and that is the Crusades. So, okay, Ad Kan for today. I'm happy to take any questions that people might have.
Yes. Can you put up the map of the Khazars, please?
Yes, I can. The map of the Khazars. Here we go. Map of Khazars.
Okay. Now, the name looks very similar, and the area also to Kazakhstan, the Cossacks. So it's very confusing for me.
My apologies. I just took the information I got from Dunlop's History of the Jews of Khazar, and I just drew a line between the Sea of Azov and the Volga River, and the Caucasus Mountains, and I think that's the what sea is it? Now I'm forgetting the name of the sea on the eastern side, but that's I just drew those crudely. So,
Caspian.
Caspian
The
Sea.
Caspian.
Yes,
No,
the Caspian Sea.
basically the relation between Kazakhstan and Kazakhstan.
Yeah. So
One
the
is with
stand part
R and one is with
I
T.
invented the stand part. Nobody else. That's my cudism that I put in Khazarstan. So maybe it's related to Kazakh.
You see how things get started, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm no different than the Arab historians who wrote theirs based on rumor. Right.
But is
No,
there
the one
any?
thing is interesting about them, and I forgot to mention this, is that they hold the line against Muslim expansion in the 7th and 8th century. So that we believe to be true. That they were sort of a buffer against the Arabs coming into Eastern Europe. Yes, Dan.
Well, we don't really have any real evidence of that. This is just, normal. But the point I'm getting at is, if in fact we hold to this story, and it in fact is not actual or real, doesn't this give credibility then to the anti-Semitics to say, look, at the foundation that you really go on in story after story isn't real. Therefore, you as a people aren't real.
Well, no, hold on a second. I think, first of all, let's just contextualize these things. This, if you want to tell me the story of Jeremiah is not real, I can show you that there's really, really, really strong evidence that the stories of Jeremiah are real. That I can pull out of the ground that Ramat Rachel, the evidence of the palace that Jeremiah was talking about when he was criticizing the kings of Israel, and I can pull out Bula with the names of Jeremiah's jailers, and I can pull out jug handles with the name of King Chizkiyahu and of Isaiah the prophet, and I can show you the walls that were built by Ezra and Nehemiah. There's lots of very good evidence of all that stuff. So there's one weird book that, I shouldn't say weird book, there's one book that's written in Spain in the year 1140 that references a conversion of the Khazars that doesn't appear in anybody's siddur, doesn't appear in very, very much of any of our halachic literature. This is sort of a sideshow, right? You can tell me that one's not true because somebody evaluated it not to be true. I don't think that undermines us. Yeah, Sam.
I'm surprised there's only one.
What's that?
I'm surprised there's only one.
Yeah, that's my point. I think there's more than one, that we don't have factual evidence.
Okay, so I challenge you. There's a relatively learned group of Jews on this call. Tell me another book of, that's in the average, rabbi's library that references the Khazars.
References the Khazars.
Yeah. Aside from Yehuda Levi, you're going to find it in Ramban, or you're going to find it in Nitziv, or you're going to find it in the Musar masters. They may reference the Kuzari, they may reference Yehuda Levi, but how many people are building castles on the sands of the Khazars?
I agree. It's a sideshow. Interesting and fun, but a sideshow.
Yeah, I think you have to be able. If nobody put the Khazars into Maimonides' 13 principles of faith.
Yeah,
you Rabbi. You know where things sit.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
It's not even clear that Yehuda Levi meant it as real. No, in the same way that one can say that Eov never took place.
Right.
But as a book of philosophy, it's possible to say that this is a book of philosophy as a venue for presenting ideas.
It is very clear that Halevi is more interested in philosophy than in the history of the Khazars.
Yeah, so there's no clear intent that this ever was meant to be more than a vehicle.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
In the same way, the 1001 Nights of Harun al-Rashid is also a vehicle. That's the way they used to write those times.
Right. Yeah, I agree that that's very possible, and you know, I try and report this. I hope I gain some credibility by putting things up as honestly as possible. And so, you know, Shaul Stampfer, I think he's, you know, the most contemporary word on this after evaluating all the sources. So I put him up so that you know, you can at least know that we have to look at this with a critical eye.
Rabbi,
Des and then Dan.
Do you by any chance remember the question, the famous question that King Joseph is reputed to have asked the three leaders of the Jews, Christians, and Muslims? He asked a question, and based on that answer, he decided to throw his lots into the Jews. Do you remember what that question was?
What's your recipe for tomatoes?
I am not remembering that question, so I will have to. There, I am a little bit. I think he asks them. I think he asked them about his dream, right? That how can he be good in principle and not in deeds? Could be wrong. You know. I know that that's where his dream starts. I also know that Rabbi Schachter, in the morning class, he did kuzari in the morning sessions for a number of weeks. So, it has been a while since I cracked the pages of the kuzari on that level on how the questions start.
I remember it was like quite clever cross-examination, but it was also a long time since I looked at the book, so I can't remember what it is now.
I will try and get that. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Oh, yes, Dina.
All this source, when you were showing the different sources, the different people that had written about the Khuzarim, did they all use the same resources to base their ideas on?
It looks like the Jewish sources may have been the original piece, and then they were heard about by the Muslims. So it may have been a bit of a game of telephone in that, because none of them are contemporary with when it actually happens, right? Because when you look at the chronology, so the Jewish letters are from around the time of around 915, 10th century, and then you have the Meadows of Gold, which is at 983, which is a little bit later than that, and then each of these other subsequent works, you know, go all the way up to the 10th century. So it does seem that they play off of one another, and there may be a bit of a game of echo or telephone in them.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well,
thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Everyone have a great night. And just one more reminder that tomorrow night we go from ancient and interesting to directly relevant Judaism and the environment tomorrow night.
Right. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Everyone have a great night.
Great, Rabbi. Good evening.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.